Welcome to video number 4 on player movement, controls and enemy variety. I think I'll start this one a little more positively by pointing out a couple of things Skyrim does right that may be taken for granted. Firstly, the button that activates sprinting also deactivates sprinting. You can just toggle it on and off when needed, giving the player more control over stamina management. There's no need to awkwardly come to a halt momentarily, only to begin moving again at a slower pace. I'm looking at you, Dragon's Dogma. You also have a bad double jump and fall damage system. And next, I was a little pleasantly surprised at this, because I don't think I've ever needed to use it, but you can transition from a sprint into an attack. You don't have to stop moving. And there's even a different animation if you do so that's neat. Moving on, player movement is mostly fine as it is, but there are some tweaks to make. Firstly, bring back athletics and acrobatics a little bit more by including more perks for them, and also incremental improvements in athleticism with increasing skill level and attributes. Next, add a fast swim as the aquatic equivalent of sprinting. Currently, you cannot go from a sprint into a jump. You have to slow down to a jog first. This also applies on horseback, and the regular jump there has too much of a delay. But on the plus side, it was nice of them to let you back up from cliff edges. Putting into the game the option of a longer running jump could add a little extra something to the platforming, and make the controls more complete. And this also ties back to the improved acrobatics perk, giving some players an alternative to the whirlwind sprint shout, if they don't have a high enough level of it to reach an area. Sprint jumping has already been implemented in Fallout 4, so this will probably be changed in the next game. I know nobody uses the janky horse combat, but why not let us use magic, shields and shouts while mounted as well as weapons? Well, as for the magic, firstly, there are spells that fix the player in place, but this should be fine because the horse isn't the one doing the magic. They should still be able to move while the player casts on top of them. But really, I think it's because of the melee. The left button attacks on one side, and the right button attacks on the other. Now, if you only have melee equipped, or only have magic equipped, that shouldn't be a problem. But if you equip a weapon and magic, then the game would have to make a choice for the player, either to not allow them to cast their spell, or to not let them attack on one side. So instead, the devs decided to just disallow magic entirely. And the same logic applies to the use of shields on horseback as well. What should be implemented instead is a system where you attack on the left or right side, depending on the direction you are looking, and have the left and right buttons act the same as they would on foot, thus allowing the player to use weapons, shields, and magic while mounted. Additionally, horse movement should be relative to the horse, not to the camera, because looking around while moving is awkward and limited to a narrow range. As for why we can't use shouts and powers on horseback, I don't know. Maybe they didn't want to implement extra mounted shout animations. Or maybe it was just easier and more consistent to exclude all shouts and powers rather than just some of them. A final addition to mounted controls is that pressing the activate button while on horseback should still let the player talk to NPCs and grab items, whereas holding the activate button should dismount. This would make horses more convenient to use and reduce the amount of time spent getting on and off of them. If it doesn't already, crouching should reduce the height of the player's collision box, both making them a smaller target for projectiles to hit, and granting the opportunity to expand the world and dungeon design by including crawl spaces and duckable obstacles. Sprinting into a crouch could result in a slide, carrying the player under obstacles while maintaining momentum, or behind cover. The sprint button could be remapped to L3, sneak to R3, and the point of view shifted to the touchpad. On Xbox that would be the view button, and on PC that could be Control, Shift and Alt, or anything else the player wants. This would free up both the L1 and R1 button to be used for magic and other special powers. Skyrim's shout gimmick probably won't be in the next game, considering we played as the last Dragonborn, and there's no need to continue playing as Dragonborns in following games, and this is fine. In fact, I think shouts share a little responsibility for the downgrading of magic in Skyrim. Some of them make magic effects less exclusive to certain magic schools, thus giving the player less reason to use them. And once or twice, they straight up take away spell effects from a magic school entirely. Another blow to magic is that some spell effects have been straight up removed since previous games, and to add insult to that injury, shouts gain a bunch of new effects that could have been used to fill those voids instead. Anyway, using these two buttons for magic and powers allows for magic-only builds, as per the current state, keeping the magic dual wielding and perhaps even giving the extra edge of not having to spend time drawing fists first. Magical staves would become more useful, allowing up to 4 spells to be equipped at one time, 2 from the user's equipped spells, and 2 from the staves themselves, with additional blunt damage from the staff's alternate attack, dual attack, or bash attack. More convenient and powerful builds that supplement weapons with magic. Convenient because the gameplay would be interrupted less by constant switching between weapons and spells, and powerful because the user would have access to both weapon slots and magic at the same time, which would make magic more appealing even without any further changes. And weapon-only builds would also benefit from having 2 powers ready to go at any time, instead of just 1 power or 1 shout. If you're like me, you can end up favoriting so many things, just on the off chance you need them, that the favourites list becomes too long to navigate, almost defeating the point. I think favourites could be split up into 4 smaller favourites menus. These could be left as an arbitrary Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 and Group 4, with the player choosing how to categorise them themselves. For example, both hands or right hand equips, left hand equips, consumables and powers, or weapons, spells and powers, consumables, and enchanted gear. To set them, in the inventory you would hold down triangle and then press one of the 4 D-pad buttons to select a group. While the favourites menu is open in-game, listings could be equipped to the left or right hand using the left or right bumpers or triggers, and items that require both or no hands can also be used with the interact button. And finally, I think Skyrim is in need of more movement options and other mechanical variety for enemies, but I'm not overly optimistic about that because, you know, Bethesda. For example, there could be sprinting enemies that are better at pursuing the player, a charging enemy, which is already a staple of other games, and is a mechanic that already exists in Skyrim. Mounted enemies, especially in the military factions, which would use cavalry. Jumping enemies that can cross small gaps to reach the player. Jumping enemies that have great horizontal and vertical mobility and use hit and run tactics. Flying enemies, specifically smaller, weaker ones that swoop in for melee attacks and don't care if you think you're out of reach. Small enemies that emerge from or follow the player through crawl spaces. Burrowing enemies that pop out of the ground to ambush the player or take refuge there.
I'm sorry. Oh my god.
Maybe a mystical teleporting enemy. There are 1 or 2 of these in the game, but they're unique. Perhaps a creature that flees once they notice the player and teleports or burrows away into the ground and drops some valuable material, such as gems or alchemical ingredients. An enemy that uses illusion magic or hallucinogenic poison to create duplicates of themselves, with only one of them being the real deal.
Oh my god, there are multiple ones!
This was also a missed opportunity for the phantom form shout to act as a decoy. Some enemies should occasionally use the new quick step and parry mechanics, where an attack during the parried state would count as an automatic critical hit. A form of enemy stealth could be implemented easily. First, categorize the enemy as non-hostile, so they don't show up on the compass or trigger combat music. Have them approach the player, preferably from behind, crouched with weapons drawn. If they are not engaged in combat first, then their initial attack is an automatic critical hit. Otherwise they stop crouching and fight normally. Invisibility effects would be an easy way to improve enemy stealth, and also give more value to detect life effects. There could be low mobility, one-directional armoured enemies, which are tough at the front but die quickly if you manoeuvre around to hit them from behind. Or maybe just a more generalised damage increase for attacks from behind, but without silly backstab angles, or the attacker being locked into an invincible animation. NPCs should try to encircle a lone hostile, or cluster up and fight more defensively when against many foes, so as to avoid being backstabbed, but scatter if area of effect attacks are used against them. Spriggans regenerate, and there's maybe a couple of bosses that need to be killed multiple times, but I'm thinking more along the lines of a lich that keeps reanimating or remains unkillable until you find and destroy the soul vessel. Or a group of weaker enemies that keep resurrecting unless you find and kill the conjurer. Dismembering corpses would also be useful against such enemies. More use of poison by enemies, so poison resistance can be a more valid thing to invest in. Reptiles, amphibians, insects, arachnids, plants, all sorts of things use poison. An enemy that deals damage based on touch or proximity, either with spikes or elemental auras. Sure, cloak spells exist in the game, but how often do you actually encounter those? This could also be a way to upgrade Atronach summons. A wraith enemy that can only be killed with magic or some other special weapon. This may be too inconvenient to come across as a regular enemy, so they should be limited to one area or one quest where the player is given the means to deal with them if they don't have one already. And maybe ghosts could go back to dropping ectoplasm, Bethesda? Multi-boss fights, different from ad fights, where there are two or more complementary bosses that gang up to make one more challenging unit. And finally, why do dragons not use more shouts? It's literally their language. They speak it fluently multiple times in the game. The special chosen one comes along and they can do all sorts of bullshit with the dragon's language, but the dragons themselves, with some exceptions, are pretty much limited to frost breath and fire breath. They could be a much bigger problem to deal with if, partway through a fight, they pull out a disarm shout, or reduce the player's armor rating, or call some nearby animals for help, or start whirlwind sprinting all over the place. With some bad luck, things could get hectic real fast, and give players more reason to plan ahead for the arduous task of bringing down a dragon. Say by bringing a backup weapon, or an armor potion, or a command creature spell. Dragon fights would have more variety because of the different shouts each dragon could pull out to deal with the one thing that's a threat to them. Seeing a dragon use a new shout effect would also give the player an idea of other shouts that may be out there in the world to find. Overall, I think they should have either invested that effort into the magic system instead, or leaned more into shouts, allowing them to be used on horseback, fleshing them out more, and making this game stand out from the others because of it. Possibly linking shouts to the underutilized speech skill with their own perks, with added skill experience, and therefore more incentive for using them. Also, doing the Bard's College quest could result in finding something a little better than just another word of Whirlwind Sprint. The player probably already has the first word or two at this point in the game, so giving them the next one is kind of an underwhelming reward. Maybe the Dragonborn could also gain dragon knowledge from this quest, after killing King Olaf and freeing the Bard, essentially being given the word and unlocking it for free. Or they could be given a different shout altogether, preferably one that's not given by the main quest line, and one that's more pertinent to Olaf's character, or maybe give some insight into his true story, whatever that may be. Or a permanent buff to shouting, similar to how Frostflow Abyss results in a permanent buff to restoration. And finally, the cooldown indicator for shouts should also give a visual guide for charging them up. 1-word and 3-word shouts are easy to perform by just tapping or holding the button, but 2-word shouts can be tricky to pull off if you don't already know the timing. That's all for now. The next video is going to be on armour, weapons and smithing.